An heiress to a fortune falls critically ill just as her marriage was falling apart. Decades after a sensational trial where her husband was the defendant, people still ask if justice was done. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crime Lines. Hello and welcome back to Crime Lines, or welcome for the first time if you're new to the podcast. I release 3 episodes a month on the main feed and then 2 on Patreon. So if you like this episode, there is plenty more to listen to in the back catalog and plenty more to come. This case was requested by someone a couple of years ago, and I did not write down who it was because at the time I couldn't cover it. I actually researched and wrote a script on this case for a different podcast. They paid me for it, so it's not appropriate to then reuse the research they paid for to turn around and make a competing episode. However, there is no longer any competition because that show has long since been canceled, and the network that put it out was bought by another network. I don't even know if they use the name anymore. Anyway, literally nobody cares is the point. But I still hesitated to reuse research from other projects I've been paid to work on, and this case really wasn't one that had a central social or legal issue like what I usually cover on Crime Lines. Yet here I am covering it, and that's because in the years since I first researched this case, I learned a lot more about one of the central topics, and it impacted greatly how I viewed this case. I am well old enough now and have been humbled enough times in my life that I should already know this, but still this reminds me that we need to be open to new information and that we need to be open to the idea that we don't know or understand everything. It's a lesson that life has had to teach me a lot and will probably have to keep knocking me down a few pegs until I finally get it. So if you're the person who recommended this case to me and I said I couldn't cover it and now I am, please reach out. I like to give people shout outs when they recommend cases, and I know sometimes I forget, but if I ever forget and you recommended a case to me, just send me an email and I will give you a shout out on the next episode. So all of that to say, this is the case of Sunny von Bulow, who was a socialite, and her fame came from her wealth. She was literally famous for how rich she was. Sunny was born Martha Sharp Crawford, and she was the only daughter of George Crawford, who was a businessman who made the bulk of his fortune in oil and gas. She was nicknamed Sunny when she was young because she was such a happy child, and the nickname stuck throughout her life. It's what everyone called her. Her parents had a huge age difference. They married in 1927 when George was 66 and Sunny's mother, Annie, was 27. Sunny was born in 1932 when George was 71 years old. In 1935, when Sunny was about 2.5, George died, leaving everything to his young widow and his daughter. His $100 million fortune was more than enough to set them up for life. I mean, $100 million today is enough, but back then, that's the equivalent of $2.2 billion. So by her 3rd birthday, Sunny was one of the world's wealthiest women. As such, she moved in high social circles, which put her at the same events and parties as royalty, such as Austrian Prince Alfred von Augsburg. In 1957, at the age of 25, Sunny married the prince. Prince Alfred had a title, but not much money. But now we take the royal title and add Sunny's wealth to it, and that sounds like a socially winning combination. The two had 2 children together, Princess Annie Laurie, who was born in 1958 and called Alla for short, and Prince Alexander George, born in 1959. But the marriage soon fell apart, mostly due to infidelity on Prince Alfred's part. There was an affair with an Italian film star that ended up in the media, and that marked the end of the marriage. The two were still legally married, but each one with a foot out the door when, in 1964, 32-year-old Sunny met 37-year-old Klaus von Bulow at a dinner party. Klaus was a Danish-born British lawyer who had fled Nazi-occupied Denmark when he was just 16. At the time they met, Klaus was working as an assistant to oil tycoon J. Paul Getty. The two immediately hit it off, but they had to keep their relationship quiet while Sunny negotiated a divorce from her husband. Motivated to get the marriage dissolved so she could move on, Sunny ended up giving Prince Alfred all of their properties in Europe and a single payout of $1 million, which is about $9 million in today's money. In exchange for this, Sunny wanted full custody of their two children, not just physical custody, but legal as well, so that she could live with them full-time in the United States. They were, at the time, ages 6 and 7. Prince Alfred agreed, and the divorce was settled to everyone's satisfaction, more or less. And with it resolved, Sunny and Klaus married in 1966. They lived with Sunny's two children in a 14-room, Fifth Avenue apartment that overlooked Central Park in New York City. Klaus came into the marriage with no children, but he really jumped into the role of stepfather. Then 10 months after their wedding, Sunny gave birth to their daughter, and the family enjoyed travel between their various residences and sent the kids to the best schools. Early on, the marriage was everything Sunny had dreamed of with her first husband. Soon enough, though, Klaus had stopped working. There was some dispute on whether that was Sunny's idea or Klaus's, but financially it didn't really matter. Sunny had so much money that they didn't really need his income. They spent a lot of time together, though Klaus later said that the intimate side of their relationship fizzled after their daughter's birth. But it would be years before rumors started going around that Klaus was stepping outside of the marriage. By the late 1970s, early 80s, so about 14 years into their marriage, these rumors had made their way to Sunny, and she told her older children from her first marriage that she was looking at divorcing Klaus. She didn't mention to them that she had heard rumors that he was cheating on her or that she suspected it. But they themselves were young adults at this point, socializing in the city, and may have heard them on their own. These weren't just vague rumors that he was cheating, but a very specific rumor that Klaus had an ongoing relationship with Alexandra Isles, who was best known to the general public for her 2-year, 400-plus episode run as Victoria Winters in the soap opera Dark Shadows. By the time Alexandra and Klaus met in March 1979, she was no longer acting and hadn't in over a decade, it appears. From her point of view, she and Klaus were planning to get married after he divorced Sunny. But then it looked to her like Klaus was dragging his feet on it, so she gave him an ultimatum. Leave Sunny by Thanksgiving 1979, or she was calling things off. At the time, it gave him a few months to figure out an exit strategy. When he didn't move out or file for divorce by that point, Alexandra assumed he never would, and she broke up with him. She was not going to be a woman who got strung along for years thinking a divorce was coming. It doesn't seem like Alexandra knew that Sunny herself was also contemplating a divorce, but Sunny had started struggling with her health. Her main symptom was extreme fatigue, and when you have really low energy, it's hard to get up and get anything done, let alone begin the process of negotiating a divorce when you have a child and a vast fortune to protect. Sunny's health really came to the point of an emergency situation for the first time in December 1979, shortly after Alexandra's ultimatum had come and went. Klaus and Sunny was 47 at the time, were at their Newport, Rhode Island mansion for the Christmas holidays. They hosted a big holiday party, and the next day, Sunny was sleeping in. Sunny's housekeeper, Maria, heard Sunny moaning in bed, so she went to check on her. Klaus was in the room and told Maria that Sunny was fine. She was just sleeping in after having had a little too much to drink. But then Sunny gasped, and to Maria, she seemed to be struggling to breathe. Maria tried to wake her up, but when she couldn't, she told Klaus they needed to call a doctor. According to Maria, Klaus seemed entirely unconcerned, but Maria eventually wore him down and he agreed to call the doctor. Over the phone, the doctor told Klaus to let Sunny rest, but to call back if she seemed to get worse. Maria was afraid that Klaus had downplayed Sunny's condition to the doctor, but Klaus thought Maria was overreacting. A few hours later, though, when Sunny's breathing became more labored, Maria pushed Klaus to call the doctor back and have him come out to the house to check on her. The doctor came and was examining Sunny when suddenly she threw up, asphyxiating on the vomit. This then sent her into respiratory and cardiac arrest. The doctor acted quickly, performing CPR and literally saving her life because had he not been there, Sunny almost surely would have died. She was then rushed to the hospital, still unconscious until the next day. And while his wife lay in her hospital bed, Klaus called his girlfriend, Alexandra, at her family's home in Ireland to tell her that Sunny was in the hospital. Klaus indicated that it was due to mixing alcohol and pills. According to Alexandra, this information horrified her, thinking that Klaus must have brought up the divorce and Sunny couldn't handle it. And this incident really shook Alexandra up as she saw the impact on Sunny that this relationship had, and it caused her to take even a bigger step back from Klaus. The doctors ran several tests, and the most alarming result was Sunny's blood sugar. It was extremely low. They diagnosed her with something called reactive hypoglycemia. Low blood sugar can come on suddenly like this, and this is where my life experience has changed my views on this case. While I knew years ago that people could have low blood sugar and that it could be serious, I thought that for the most part, severe hypoglycemia was an issue insulin-dependent diabetics mostly dealt with. I didn't know, until my own daughter was diagnosed with reactive hypoglycemia, that some people really do produce too much insulin on their own, to dangerous levels. Just for the record, I did talk to my daughter before I decided to do this episode and asked if she was okay if I mentioned this, and she said she was fine with it. Fortunately, on our end, my daughter was diagnosed before anything awful happened because we took her in for the symptoms of persistent fatigue and lightheadedness. And after the diagnosis, we've quickly responded to her symptoms. And though she has passed out, never was it anything like what happened to Sunny where she was in a coma. Hypoglycemia is treated most of the time by diet alone, and the diet is almost identical to a diabetic diet. It's balancing carbs and protein and eating smaller, more frequent meals. But it's really hard to change your dietary habits, and I've definitely seen it with my daughter. She is a teenager, and trying to make sure she eats the right things at the right time while she's running out the door for school, then she has soccer practice, and then her part-time job, and then she's out with friends, she's at the mall, she's grabbing quick food. It's hard. Now, Sunny was not a teenager, but she did have irregular eating habits and a sweet tooth. So she was still dealing with the symptoms of hypoglycemia, including fatigue, throughout the next year. And when Alexandra later learned that Sunny's hospitalization was due to hypoglycemia and it was no one's fault, she started seeing Klaus again in the summer of 1980. She believed him, again, when he said he was going to leave his wife. But again, she was not going to be strung along for too long this time. After a few months, she broke up with him again. It was almost a year after the first hypoglycemic incident when Sunny and Klaus and the family went out to their mansion for Christmas, just as they did the year before. On December 21st, 1980, Sunny, her son Alex, and her younger daughter went out to dinner and a movie. After they came home, Alex and Sunny were chatting in the library when Klaus came in and asked Sunny if she needed anything. She said she was hungry and asked if he would heat her up a bowl of soup. About an hour after eating the soup, Sunny said she wasn't feeling well. She was fatigued and had poor coordination once she was up on her feet. Alex ended up carrying her into her bedroom, and then he went to find Klaus to let him know that Sunny was sick. Alex then went back to the bedroom to check on his mom again and saw that Sunny was trying to walk from the bathroom back to her bed. He went to her side to help her when Klaus walked in. Klaus then said he would take it from there, and Alex went to bed. The next morning, Alex slept in, and he didn't head down for breakfast until nearly lunchtime. He was surprised that Sunny wasn't up when he went downstairs because she usually would eat with him when he slept late. Klaus had been out walking the dogs, so when he came in, Alex asked him if his mother was still in bed. Klaus said he assumed she had gotten up, but he had been out with the dogs, so he didn't know. He decided to then go check on Sunny. Alex said it was about 10 to 15 minutes later that Klaus came back to the dining room. He didn't say anything, but he motioned for Alex to follow him. Alex followed Klaus to the bathroom, and there he saw Sunny lying on the floor. Alex thought she was dead, and if it was me, I'd be stunned that my stepfather took me in the bathroom to see my mother's body, but Klaus said no, she was still breathing, and then he went off to call for help. Sunny von Bulow, then 48, was alive, but just barely. When paramedics reached her, her body temperature was 81 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 27 degrees Celsius, which is low enough that she actually felt cool to the touch. And her heart rate was 35 beats per minute. It should have been at least 60. Her heart was beating and she was breathing, so they rushed her to the hospital to try to stabilize her. Klaus climbed into the back of the ambulance with her, though his behavior made the paramedic uncomfortable. Paramedics are used to various reactions from loved ones, but the paramedic said that Klaus was the first person he had in the back of his ambulance who just sat there stoically. He didn't try to hold Sunny's hand or ask any questions, offer any information, try to comfort her. Nothing. Now, I say all the time that there's no one appropriate response to something like this, but I'm bringing this up because the paramedic would later speak to the police about it, and this observation during a medical emergency would end up part of the investigation and criminal case later. After running a number of tests on Sunny in the first few days, the doctors concluded that Sunny was not going to come out of this coma. Whatever had happened had deprived her brain of oxygen for so long that she was in a persistent vegetative state, and that much they were able to tell the family. What they weren't quite as sure about was exactly what caused it. A year before, she had a severe hypoglycemic event and cardiac arrest. Was it one of those things, both of those things, that happened again? It was going to take more tests to figure out exactly what happened here, but they were leaning towards this being a repeat of what had happened the year before. So the doctors were looking at this as a natural medical occurrence, but Sunny's older two children had some other questions about what happened. To put it bluntly, they were both suspicious of Klaus. The suspicion had started nearly right away in Alex's mind. The day was very cold, yet Klaus was out on this long walk with the dogs when Sunny just so happened to have a medical emergency inside the house. Why was he out in the cold that long? And then why did it take him at least 10 minutes to go find Sunny on the bathroom floor and then go get Alex? It seems like that entire process should have taken a fraction of that time. And for that matter, why did Klaus go get Alex at all? Sunny needed help, so it didn't make sense for there to be any delay between when Klaus found her and when he called for help. And then there was the question of the possible divorce and the ongoing affair. After Sunny had slipped into the coma, her older two children did ask Klaus about his extramarital relationship. And Klaus said, that Sonny knew about it, or at least knew about it in theory. He told them that after the sexual relationship in their marriage had fallen apart, Sonny essentially gave him permission to step outside the marriage so long as he kept it discreet. That was not something either of them expected to hear, particularly knowing how devastated their mother had been when their father had cheated on her. And it seemed particularly specific that Prince Alfred cheated with an actress, and now here Klaus's girlfriend had also been an actress. Sonny's children couldn't imagine her choosing an open marriage and being okay with his relationship with Alexandra Isles when she could have just divorced Klaus, who was a man she was largely financially supporting. So Sonny's older kids went to her mother, their grandmother Annie, with their concerns about their stepfather, and she told them that she had never trusted Klaus. She always suspected he was more interested in Sonny's money than in Sonny, and she also knew some details of the prenup the two had signed. If the couple divorced, the vast majority of Sonny's fortune would be protected. While some have said the prenup would have left Klaus with nothing in the event of a divorce, it seems like he would have gotten something. But nothing like the $12 to $14 million he stood to inherit if Sonny died. And how many cases have we covered where someone kills their spouse for a lot less than millions and millions of dollars? So we have Sonny's mother and her adult children with concerns and suspicions, but the question was what to do about it. This was a celebrity situation. If they made any waves publicly, it might turn into a media storm. That wouldn't just hurt Klaus, but it would hurt their little sister, who was just 13. And what if they were wrong, and stirring all of this up turned their mother's unfortunate health issues into a spectacle unnecessarily? That could hurt Sonny's image and her legacy. They decided that discretion was their best option, so before they were taking anything to the police, they wanted to make sure there was something there. So they hired private attorney Richard Q to look into it. Q agreed to meet with Sonny's older children in his New York office on January 5th, 1981, just 2 weeks after Sonny was found on the bathroom floor. And after they laid out their story for him, Q admitted that it all did seem suspicious. The motive was there for sure, and it was Klaus who gave Sonny the meal of soup shortly before she started to feel ill. It was Klaus who was with her all night, and it was Klaus who apparently delayed calling for help. And it was nearly an identical scenario to the year before when Sonny had the first incident. Q agreed that he would make some discreet inquiries and asked the family to send him Sonny's medical records. He could then get an expert to look at her test results to see if there were any signs of something like being drugged or poisoned. He also got a list of names from them of people he should talk to, and near the top of that list was Sonny's longtime housekeeper, Maria. Maria was the one who had, a year before this, pushed Klaus to call for help the first time Sonny was unconscious, supposedly due to low blood sugar. Q learned that Maria suspected Klaus did something even back then. She was alarmed at his reluctance to call for help and at his insistence that Sonny was just hungover, when Maria herself didn't know Sonny to be that much of a heavy drinker. She also overheard Klaus's initial phone call with the doctor that day, and she told Q that he downplayed and misrepresented the severity of Sonny's symptoms. Maria accepted the diagnosis of reactive hypoglycemia at first, assuming that the doctors knew best, but she still had a bad feeling about how Klaus had dug in and just refused to call for help, even when, according to her, Sonny was very clearly sick. Then, in February of 1980, 2 months after that first incident, Maria said she was cleaning the New York apartment when she found a large travel bag in Sonny and Klaus's shared walk-in closet. It was a bag she had never seen before, and curious, she looked inside. In the bag was a smaller black pouch. Then she decided to look in the pouch, so maybe we can upgrade her from curious to nosy at this point. When she looked in there, she saw 3 vials, one containing pills, one containing a powder, and one containing a liquid, all with the label scratched off. Fast forward to November 1980, around Thanksgiving, and Maria saw the pouch again, this time in a white canvas bag in Klaus's room. She would later say that this time when she looked inside, she also saw a needle and a 4th vial, and she said this vial was labeled insulin. And then when the family went to Newport for Christmas 1980, Maria saw that white canvas bag with the black pouch among Klaus's pile of things to bring with him. If what Maria was telling Richard Q was true, shortly before Sonny fell into that coma, Klaus had drugs and insulin in his possession. Was it possible Klaus used one or both of those things to hurt Sonny? Q then got the medical report that honestly really didn't help clear things up. According to the medical report Q was given, the coma appeared to have been caused by Sonny's hypoglycemia. While there were barbiturates in her system, it was considered a small amount, not enough to have had a huge impact in that moment. However, her insulin levels were 8 times higher than the safest maximum level. And this is pretty much how reactive hypoglycemia works. If you have reactive hypoglycemia, it usually hits within 4 hours after you eat when your insulin levels spike, causing your blood glucose to plummet dangerously low. The types of foods that generally cause this reaction are simple carbs. Soup, which is the last thing we know Sonny ate, wouldn't have done this, but it is said that Sonny ate a large ice cream sundae with toppings on it that night. And that certainly could have caused a reactive hypoglycemic event. As for coming home and then being hungry and asking for soup, hunger is a symptom of low blood sugar. But soup isn't always going to be enough to get the blood sugar up and then stabilize it. So Sonny's symptoms could have continued through the night until she was found on the bathroom floor the next day. On the other hand, her insulin levels were very high, even for a reactive hypoglycemic event. And she was found in the bathroom the next morning, meaning she was well enough many hours later to walk to the bathroom. It didn't make a lot of sense that she was upright so many hours later only to collapse again. Not that it couldn't have happened, but it definitely seemed a little odd. The medical evidence at this point really could only tell them that too much insulin was one of the main causes of Sonny's coma. But what was the cause of too much insulin? Was it reactive hypoglycemia? Or was it an external dose of insulin? The family came to believe that Sonny didn't ever have reactive hypoglycemia. They believed she had been given insulin not just once, but twice, causing both comas. One she recovered from, and the other she didn't. The only person alone with her both times was Klaus. Richard Q at this point was leaning towards the family's theory as well. However, there was no solid evidence. Though Maria said she showed the vial of insulin to Alex, at the time he told Q that he didn't remember it. Q wanted to see the pouch of vials for himself, but Alex had looked and he couldn't find it. He checked both the Newport mansion and the New York apartment, and he suspected that Klaus may have locked it in the closet of his study, which was one of the very few places Alex didn't have access. If they wanted to see what was in the closet, they would have to get into it. So Richard Q recruited a PI from New York City to go out to Newport with Alex. Once there, they hired a locksmith to help get them into the closet when they knew Klaus wouldn't be home. So Alex, the PI, and the locksmith entered Klaus's office, and in his desk, Alex found a ring of keys. The locksmith looked at the lock and at the keys and let them know immediately which key would open the door. They got pretty lucky. They wouldn't have to break in. They unlocked the closet door, but before they opened it, the PI suggested that they collect any evidence that was out in plain sight. He knew that they were bending the law a bit by looking in places they knew they didn't have permission to be, though they weren't working on behalf of law enforcement, so it could be a gray area in any future court proceedings, so he wanted to be at least a little cautious. They didn't find much in the room aside from a vial in Klaus's desk that was marked Valium. They then decided to go through the closet. In the closet, they found a metal box towards the back, and inside that box, they found the pouch just as Maria had described it. They dumped the contents out on Klaus's desk. There were medicine bottles, a vial of a blue liquid, and 3 hypodermic needles. 2 were still sealed in their packaging, but the third was open. According to Alex, in looking at it more closely, it was obviously used. There was something dried on the tip, but there was no vial of insulin. They decided to take the contents of the pouch with them. They hired a private lab to analyze the items, and they learned that the medications were all sedatives, which had occasionally been prescribed to Sonny and/or Klaus. But the dried substance on the needle, according to the lab, was insulin. That's when the family and their attorney decided it was time to go to the police. In March of 1981, 3 months after Sonny slipped into her coma, they handed over everything to the police, except for Richard Q's personal notes about his meetings with the family and witnesses. They had retained him as legal counsel, so he held the notes back as they were protected by attorney-client privilege. So the police had pretty much everything the family had, including the lab results, but they needed to redo the tests in their lab with their protocols for the sake of court, and the results came back the same. Because of Sonny's test results, the sedatives weren't entirely relevant, but the insulin definitely was. The investigators then went back to the initial incident report from the day Sonny was found on the bathroom floor and started this investigation at the beginning. Because this had initially appeared to be a clear-cut medical incident, there hadn't been much digging before this. One of the investigators noticed the position that Sonny was found in. Her nightgown had been bunched up around her waist, like she collapsed as she was going to use the toilet, or perhaps as she stood up after. But if that was what happened, the way she fell didn't make sense. With her feet on the ground near the toilet, you would expect them to still be near the toilet when she collapsed. Instead, her head was by the toilet bowl, practically underneath it. So the lead investigator, who thought this positioning didn't sound quite right, went home and talked his wife into helping him recreate the scene while she was wearing her nightgown. She fell every which way she could imagine, but they couldn't come up with any scenario that had her head by the toilet and the nightgown pulled up. Then they tried a different idea. The investigator carried his wife into the bathroom and put her on the floor near the toilet. As she slid from his arms, her nightgown rode up to her waist, and her head landed next to the toilet. This is not the most scientifically rigorous experiment I have ever seen, but it led him to believe that Klaus had picked Sonny up from the bed and moved her to the bathroom to make it look like that is where she collapsed. The thought was, under this theory, that Sonny was in bad shape while still in bed with Klaus, and he may have delayed calling the police for hours and hours while he went out walking the dogs, rather than just the 10 to 15 minutes Alex was aware of. To cover up for that, he moved her to the bathroom to make it look like she had walked in there herself. The next step in the investigation was to then speak to everyone who may know something, and that included Klaus. He was not aware the investigation into what happened to his wife was still ongoing until the police showed up at his New York City apartment wanting to talk. And letting him know there was an investigation was one of the main reasons they were there. If Klaus had done something to his wife, he wasn't exactly going to tell them. But if he knew there was an investigation, he might feel some pressure. And if he thought things were going to get stirred up, he might try to get rid of any evidence, like that black pouch. So after talking to Klaus, they staked out the mansion, the alleged crime scene. It took 3 days before Klaus showed up. The investigators let Klaus get out of the car and go into the house before they knocked at the front door. When he answered, they provided him with a search warrant for the mansion and asked Klaus if he minded answering a few questions while the police searched. Klaus said sure and sat down to talk to some investigators while others started the search. Some headed straight to the study where they found that the closet door was wide open. That's the same closet where Alex, the PI, and the locksmith all said they found the black pouch inside a metal box. Also, in the study, on a pad of paper, they noticed that someone had written the words, "black box." To the police, it looked like Klaus may have been searching the closet for the pouch. After they cleared that room, they continued their search of the rest of the house while Klaus was still being questioned. At some point, Klaus asked to use the bathroom. When he returned, the officers went back into the study to see if anything had changed. This time, they reportedly found the closet door shut, locked, and the note saying black box was gone. Though Klaus didn't give up anything in his interview with the police, they were sure he was trying to cover something up in the house, and that something was the black pouch with the syringe that had insulin on it. The investigation continued, getting statements from those close to Sonny and from doctors before presenting the evidence to the grand jury. In July of 1981, 54-year-old Klaus von Bulow was indicted on 2 counts of attempted murder, one for the December 1979 incident and one for the incident in December 1980. The state's theory was that there was never any reactive hypoglycemia. Both instances were caused by injections of insulin in an attempt to kill Sonny. After his arrest, Klaus pleaded not guilty and paid his bail. And then the media storm that the family had initially tried to avoid, or at least delay, came in full force. By the time the trial began 6 months later in January of 1982, it's hard to even express what a circus this was. It was an O.J. Simpson. It was a Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard level trial. But this was in a time before we really had those, because trials, back then, were not often broadcast, or at least not in their entirety. In fact, this was the first major criminal trial that was on national television. So you can imagine what a spectacle it was. There were women who were showing up in shirts that said "Free Klaus," in spite of the fact that he had been out on bail that whole time and he wasn't exactly not free. The media went and dubbed these women the Clausettes. Never mind that Sonny von Bulow was lying in a vegetative state with her children currently grieving their mother while she was still alive. And now they were going to have to go through a trial. In the prosecution's opening statement, the jury was told that Klaus knew Sonny was on the verge of divorcing him, and he did not want to be reduced to the limited funding that would come with that. He wanted both the money that came with being married to Sonny and his girlfriend, who he could only have if he wasn't married to Sonny. The only way to have both things he wanted was if Sonny was dead. The first hurdle the state had was proving that this wasn't a natural medical event, and they had 2 witnesses called to the stand to prove that. The first was Sonny's usual doctor, who said she was in excellent health prior to this. He said he was suspicious after Sonny's 1979 incident. It was a different doctor who diagnosed her with hypoglycemia. He had doubts that her body could have gotten to those levels without having been injected with insulin. Though he regretted it later, he never voiced his concerns. And then the state called another expert, Dr. Cahill, who was a leading expert in diabetes, the pancreas, and insulin production. After reviewing Sunny's medical records, he concluded that both comas were caused by external doses of insulin, and this couldn't have been natural due to how high the insulin levels were. On cross-examination, he did admit that even though he could testify that he believed Sunny had been injected with insulin, he could offer no medical opinion as to whether Sunny injected herself or if a third party was involved. And if a third party was involved, who that could be. And that was an issue for the state. They had to not just prove that Sunny was injected with insulin, they had to put the needle in Klaus's hand. And for that, they had the witness testimony about the bag. Sunny's 22-year-old son, Prince Alexander, was one of those witnesses. He told the jury that he saw the bag a couple of times between the first and second comas, and the second time, Maria, his mother's maid, asked him what insulin was for, but he admitted that he didn't actually see the label himself. Maria then took the stand to talk about what she saw and how Klaus seemed unconcerned the first time Sunny got sick. She also said she was sure there was insulin in the black pouch. The state then set up the evidence of this dual motive, first being money. Sunny's financial advisor, who had full knowledge of her accounts, the prenup, and how the inheritance would work, testified. He explained that in the event of Sunny's death, Klaus would have kept the waterfront mansion and the New York apartment, as well as $12 to $14 million. If they divorced, he would get practically nothing. And then to prove the second motive, love, they called Alexandra Isles to the stand. Like I said before, by the time she even met Klaus, Alexandra was no longer acting, and she hadn't in over a decade. But she would still be painted in the media as the daytime TV girlfriend, even though she spent all but 2 years of her life not being on television. But the dramatic soap opera star taking the stand sounds good in the press. Alexandra first testified to the details of their relationship that we already went over. The meeting, the dating, the ultimatum, all of that. But then she also told the court that in late December of 1980, Klaus called her to tell her that Sunny was again in a coma, but this time she would not recover. Because Alexandra was under the impression that the first coma was caused by hypoglycemia, she readily believed Klaus that this one was as well. So they started dating again. The relationship only lasted, this time, up to his arrest. Even though her attorney advised her to cut things off with Klaus as soon as word of the investigation got out, Alexandra didn't believe at the time he was capable of hurting Sunny. But when he was arrested, the relationship ended once and for all. At Klaus's instruction, his attorney did not cross-examine Alexandra at all. He told the judge that Klaus wanted to spare her any further public scrutiny. It was then time for the defense to lay out their case, and their defense was that Sunny was a woman with reactive hypoglycemia who also had self-destructive habits of overindulging in things like alcohol, sweets, and even barbiturates. Her coma, as sad as it was essentially her own fault. There is always some risk to a defense taking this stance because it could, to some jurors, come across as victim blaming. But that really was their defense. They weren't arguing just that Klaus didn't attempt to kill Sunny, but rather that no one did. What happened here was simply not a crime. The first witness for the defense was an interesting one. A fitness instructor named Joy came forward halfway through the state's case, claiming to have special knowledge of Sunny self-administering insulin for weight loss. Joy testified that it was in late 1978, a full year before the first coma, that she complained to Sonny about some weight she had recently gained. According to Joy, Sonny told her that she needed to try insulin. By injecting insulin, Joy could eat and drink whatever she wanted, and the insulin would, quote, eat up the sugar for her. This isn't exactly sound medical advice since insulin actually promotes fat storage, but that's not really the point. The point was that Joy was taking that insulin needle out of Klaus's hand and putting it into Sonny's. At no time in the police investigation had anyone else mentioned Sonny using insulin. Even Klaus, after being asked about insulin use, said that it was the last thing Sonny needed, given that she had reactive hypoglycemia. So the state didn't think this testimony quite fit, and any attorney will tell you that a last-minute witness for the other side is something to be concerned about since you didn't have time to vet them yourself. So while the defense moved on with their case, the state sent investigators to New York to look into Joy for any holes in her story. The defense then continued on, calling Robert, Sonny's butler, to the stand. Robert's testimony undermined Maria's. Rather than painting Klaus as an uncaring husband, Robert testified that Klaus fussed over Sonny, particularly after the 1979 incident, telling the staff to cut out the sugar in the desserts they made for her and to prepare more fruit rather than baked goods to satisfy Sonny's sweet tooth. He also instructed them to water down any cocktails they mixed for her, since alcohol can cause blood sugar levels to drop. That painted a very different picture of Klaus from the unconcerned spouse to a man trying to force his wife to stick to the diet she was supposed to be on. And then to contradict the medical testimony, the defense had their own doctor review Sonny's medical records. He testified that Sonny used tranquilizers, aspirin, tobacco, and alcohol to excess. All that indicated she was a bit out of control. And add these habits to severe hypoglycemia, and the coma really could have been a combination of all of these factors. And then came the big question, would Klaus von Bulow be taking the stand? He wanted to testify, but his attorney advised against it. He was worried that Klaus's way of speaking would seem haughty and detached to the predominantly working-class Rhode Island jury. Sometimes a jury of our peers isn't really comprised of our peers, and some, for lack of a better term, cultural miscommunications can occur. So the defense rested, and then the prosecution had a chance to rebut. And this is where their investigation into Joy paid off. While the defense was presenting their case, the investigators had gone to New York to the fitness club where Joy worked and pulled the club's records. They checked the times that Sonny was there and the times Joy had worked, and things didn't align. Joy had testified that Sonny had taken multiple classes a week with her over the course of 1978, which is how they became so close. But the records indicated that Sonny had only taken 5 of Joy's classes ever, and none of them were in 1978. They were all from before that. So while the prosecution couldn't necessarily disprove that Sonny had a conversation with Joy, they were able to call someone from the fitness club to go over these records to discredit other aspects of her story, which undermines the entirety of it. Both sides here put on solid cases, and it would be up to a jury to go through the contradicting testimony. They deliberated for nearly a week. They then came back with a verdict of guilty on both counts of attempted murder. Klaus was then allowed to remain free on bail pending his sentencing. He was facing up to 40 years in prison, but he intended to file an appeal as soon as possible. He reached out to Alan Dershowitz to help with this appeal. Now, Dershowitz is known for his involvement in high-profile and celebrity cases, but this case was actually among his first. To Klaus von Bulow, Dershowitz was simply an expert in appellate law. On May 7, 1982, sentencing was held, and Klaus was given a 30-year prison sentence. But then the judge ordered that Klaus remain free on bail pending the appeal, which happened more back in the 80s than it does today. However, the state was not comfortable with this decision. Klaus had to surrender his passport, but that didn't mean he couldn't have found a way out of the country. And being that he wasn't a U.S. citizen, he was a Danish citizen, they would have no ability to then extradite him back. So though the state objected, Klaus remained free. This appeal had a few interesting points, but the most interesting, in my view, had to do with the private attorney the family had hired. And it comes back to the notes he took. Richard Q didn't turn over his notes to the defense because he said they were protected by attorney-client privilege. However, when he testified at trial, he did refer to those notes. The appeal argued that the issue of attorney-client privilege was black and white. Either all of the notes were protected by privilege or none of them were. Since Q broke privilege when he used some of them at trial, the defense said they should have gotten a look at all of them. Now, the thing is, the defense did not know what was in those notes or if they would even help them at a new trial, but it was a point of the appeal, and having Richard Q's notes certainly wouldn't hurt. In the spring of 1984, 2 years after the conviction, the appellate court overturned the conviction. Klaus was getting a new trial, and this time his defense team would have access to Richard Q's notes. When they got them, the first thing they did was look to see the earliest point insulin was mentioned. Maria had testified that she had seen the insulin bottle before Sonny's coma, so you'd think that would have been one of the first things she mentioned to Richard Q, but it wasn't. The first time anyone mentioned the insulin, according to Q's notes, was on January 20th, 1981, which was weeks after they initially met with Q, and it was after they had learned of Sonny's high insulin level. In fairness, Q would later say that the insulin did come up earlier, but he simply hadn't written it down. These were notes for his use. These are not direct transcripts of everything everyone said to him. But that was not all they noticed. In the earliest interview, Q's notes indicated that he asked Maria what she found in the bag. She listed a few things, but she did not mention a syringe. As far as finding insulin, Maria actually said, according to Q's notes, that the labels on all of the medicine vials had been scraped off. That was a complete contradiction from her trial testimony when she said she read the label and it said insulin. And then, additionally, they found a note Q had made that the family discussed Sonny's life support fairly early on, just 2 weeks after she fell into a coma. Her older daughter told Q that Sonny would not have wanted to live in a persistent vegetative state, but she was torn about turning off her life support. Klaus had said to them that he would not make this decision. He was going to leave it up to Sonny's children to decide. So Klaus had the chance to end Sonny's life, the same thing the state argued he was trying to do. That would have allowed him to inherit. But when he had the chance to make that decision, as her husband, he deferred to her children. This conversation had never come up at the first trial, and it would have absolutely helped Klaus's case. And it also contradicted some other statements that had been made to the media, saying that Klaus wanted to disconnect Sonny's life support. So the defense had an expanded list of facts to work with going into the trial. They also managed, during the pretrial phase, to successfully argue to have Sonny's financial details excluded. So the state couldn't use her financial advisor to explain how much Klaus would get in the event of Sonny's death versus a divorce. The judge didn't really explain her decision here, except to say that the testimony was unfairly prejudicial towards Klaus. And I get the impression she may have just been trying to avoid another overturned verdict if he was convicted again. So needless to say, this second trial was going to be a lot different. Maria's testimony was consistent with what she said in the first trial. However, now the defense could confront her with her earlier statements to the family's attorney. And the same thing happened with Alex, Sonny's son. The defense confronted him with some of the notes from Richard Q that were taken 4 days after the black pouch had been found. And these notes indicated that the family had considered offering Klaus a settlement to walk away and renounce any interest in Sonny's estate. So if Alex, his sister, and their grandmother all thought Klaus tried to kill Sonny, why were they considering dropping the issue and paying Klaus to go away? It undermined how strongly the family believed Klaus was involved. So while the direct testimony was very similar to the first trial, with Richard Q's notes, the cross-examination was very different. But there was one witness for the state who had significantly different direct testimony at trial number 2, and that was Alexandra Isles, who some did not think would testify. She had, between trials 1 and 2, moved to Europe. It was characterized as she was hiding out there, but I would call it self-preservation. Alexandra initially looked like a no-show for the trial, and the judge gave the state a deadline on when she needed to testify by, or they were going to have to move on without her. The day before that cutoff, she showed up. At the second trial, Alexandra testified about a phone call she had with Klaus after Sonny's first coma. It wasn't the initial phone call while she was in Ireland that she had already told them about, but rather it was another phone call when she was back in the U.S., and it happened some point in January 1980. In this call, Klaus gave her more details about what had happened, and he told her that he and Sonny had been arguing late into the night, and Sonny had also been drinking. He said he then saw her take a Seconal pill, which is a barbiturate sleep aid. He told Alexandra that he knew Sonny wasn't doing well the next day. He sat there and he watched her get worse, but then, as he thought she was dying, he, quote, couldn't go through with it, so he called for help. Now, this story doesn't directly accuse Klaus of confessing to doing anything to cause Sonny's illness, and you wouldn't necessarily expect him to confess to someone he wanted a relationship with, but it was the closest they had to someone saying that Klaus wanted Sonny dead. While Klaus instructed his attorney in the first trial to spare Alexandra a cross-examination, that was not a courtesy he extended this time. On cross, the defense showed Alexandra a letter she had written to Klaus after the first trial, attempting to rekindle their romance. If this was a woman who thought that Klaus had tried to kill his wife and saw a jury agree with her, why did she want to be with him? But the real issue they wanted to raise for the jury was Klaus's response. He turned her down. The defense accused Alexandra then of changing her testimony to get back at him because she had been rejected. The defense had done a very good job presenting a lot of their case through the cross-examination of the state's witnesses. So when it was time for them to put on their own case, they put most of their money, time, and effort into medical witnesses. They had 8 of them, all qualified experts, who said that Sonny's initial coma was not due to low blood sugar at all. Yes, she was having a reactive hypoglycemic incident, but the actual coma was caused from the vomiting, asphyxiation, and cardiac arrest. And then the second coma, the persistent one, was caused by a combination of her reactive hypoglycemia, her drug use, and alcohol. And one of those drugs was aspirin. It came out that weeks before the second coma, Sonny had taken dozens of aspirin pills in what was called a cry for help, and Klaus was the one who rushed her to the hospital for help. And guess what aspirin does? Like alcohol, it lowers your blood sugar. The defense then brought in testimony that put the needle, the quote-unquote attempted murder weapon, into question. A doctor testified that if someone had injected insulin into themselves or someone else, there would not have been insulin left on the outside of the needle. Any of the medication that was on the outside would have been wiped off as the needle went into the skin and then as it was pulled out. What it looked like to him was that the needle could have been dipped into insulin, but not injected. Just like at the first trial, Klaus did not testify. So this jury, like the one before it, took the case never having heard from him, but having heard a lot of technical and medical evidence instead. They deliberated over the weekend of June 7th, 1985. When they returned with a verdict, Klaus was found not guilty on both charges. The only emotion he had shown over the course of 2 trials came when he heard the verdict and dropped his head in relief. After the trial, this matter became a civil one. Sonny's older children filed a $56 million civil lawsuit on Sonny's behalf, as she obviously couldn't do it herself. In December of 1987, the case was settled by the parties. The settlement was basically for Klaus to divorce Sonny, give up his claims to her money, and then move on, which he did. Moving on included not being able to write a book or otherwise grow his popularity on the back of this case. Klaus moved to London and his daughter joined him there. Alan Dershowitz said that the move to the UK was a smart one since public opinion in the US was divided. But Klaus was generally seen as a wrongfully convicted and now exonerated man in London society. Sonny then spent 28 years in a coma, dying on December 6th, 2008 at the age of 76. Klaus died in May of 2019 in London. He was 92 years old, and he had lived his final years quietly with his daughter and his grandchildren nearby. This is a case that I originally felt the state hadn't proven, but I leaned towards Klaus being involved. I realized only recently, within this last year, how much of my opinion was based on my own ignorance. I didn't understand reactive hypoglycemia, and I didn't even know what I didn't know about it. Now, I don't think that the fact that we don't know everything about everything excludes us from having an opinion, but I know that I need to remember to listen to the more educated opinions out there. That whole talk less, listen more thing, it's one of those things I will work on for the rest of my life. And hopefully I will perfect it before I ever get called to be on a jury and tasked with making a decision that will forever impact someone's life. Thank you for listening. You can find Crime Lines on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and occasionally TikTok. Crime Lines is on Patreon, where I offer early and ad-free episodes as well as bonus content. Visit patreon.com/crimelines. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crime Lines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfortproductions.com/support. And if you need a palate cleanser after listening to heavier true crime shows, check out Rusty Hinges, an allegedly funny history, mystery, and true crime show that I co-created and write for.